It began on a calm street that everyone believed was peaceful, the kind of neighborhood where people waved politely and pretended not to notice each other's business. I had parked my car in the same spot for years, right beside my driveway, never crossing a line, never blocking anyone. But that morning, when I walked out and saw a handwritten note slapped across my windshield, my stomach dropped. This is not your parking spot. Move your car or face consequences. The words were aggressive, personal, and completely unexpected. I stood there longer than I should have, reading it again and again, trying to understand how an ordinary parking space had suddenly turned into a threat. That was the exact moment I realized this wasn't about a car. It was about control, ego, and a neighbor who had decided that this street belonged to him. The neighbor responsible was a man named Mark, though at the time I only knew him as the new guy with the black SUV. He had moved in just a few weeks earlier, and from the very first day, he carried himself like someone who expected rules to bend around him. He didn't smile, didn't wave, and didn't bother with small talk. Instead, he watched. From his window, from his driveway, from behind that dark-tinted windshield. Looking back, the signs were all there. He parked slightly over the line, angled his car just enough to dominate the space, as if he were silently claiming territory. And now, with that note on my windshield, it was clear he wasn't just watching anymore. He had decided to act. At first, I tried to convince myself it was a misunderstanding. Maybe the note was meant for someone else. Maybe Mark genuinely thought the space belonged to him. So instead of confronting him, I did what any reasonable person would do. I adjusted. I parked a little further down the street, walked the extra distance, and told myself peace was worth more than pride. But peace didn't last. The very next day, I noticed something that made my blood boil. Mark had shifted his SUV forward, perfectly occupying the exact spot I had avoided. It wasn't coincidence. It was a message. He wasn't protecting a space. He was testing how far he could push me without resistance. That evening, I decided to park in my usual place again. No note this time. No warning. Just silence. But when I stepped outside the next morning, my car was trapped. Mark's SUV was parked inches from my rear bumper, so close I could barely slide my hand between the two vehicles. For a moment, I honestly thought it was an accident. Then I saw him, standing on his driveway, coffee in hand, watching me struggle. When our eyes met, he didn't apologize. He smirked. And in that small, smug smile, I understood something important. This wasn't careless parking. This was intentional. This was his way of saying, I decide when you leave. I walked over and asked him calmly to move his car. I kept my voice steady, even though my heart was racing. Mark took a slow sip of his coffee before answering, as if he were enjoying the moment. It's a public road, he said, shrugging. I can park wherever I want. There was no anger in his tone, just arrogance. No matter what I said after that, he repeated the same line, again and again, like a broken record. Neighbors peeked through their curtains, pretending not to watch, while I stood there powerless, late for work, realizing that logic meant nothing to someone who thrived on control. That day, I had to call in late to work. Standing on the pavement while Mark eventually moved his SUV on his schedule, not mine. The humiliation stayed with me long after he drove off. Over the next few days, the same thing kept happening. Sometimes he blocked my driveway completely. Other times he parked so close that I couldn't open my boot. Each incident felt carefully planned, like a game where he set the rules and changed them whenever he pleased. I started leaving my house earlier, checking outside through the curtains before stepping out, living around his behavior instead of my own routine. And that's when I realized the real damage wasn't to my car, but to my peace of mind. One night, after yet another argument that went nowhere, I sat in my living room replaying everything in my head. The notes, the smirk, the way he always stayed just within the rules while breaking the spirit of them. That's when it hit me. Anger was exactly what he wanted. Confrontation fed him. So instead of planning my next argument, I planned something else. Evidence. The next morning, I ordered a small CCTV camera. Nothing dramatic, nothing illegal. Just enough to quietly watch the street the same way Mark had been watching me. I didn't want revenge anymore. I wanted the truth recorded minute by minute. I installed the camera discreetly, angled only toward the road, careful to follow every rule Mark loved to hide behind. Then I waited. Days passed, and the footage began to reveal a pattern that was impossible to ignore. Mark didn't park randomly, he watched first. Whenever my car appeared, he stepped outside minutes later, moving his SUV with deliberate precision, inch by inch, until it sat exactly where it would cause the most inconvenience. Sometimes he paused, looked straight toward my house, and smiled to himself before walking back inside. Watching those clips late at night felt unsettling, like seeing the true face of someone who pretended to be civil but thrived on intimidation. Just when I thought it couldn't get worse, it did. One morning, I found a bright yellow parking ticket tucked under my wiper. According to it, my car had been reported for obstruction. I didn't even have to look up to know who had made the call. Mark was across the street, leaning against his fence, pretending to scroll through his phone, satisfaction written all over his face. It was his boldest move yet, turning the system against me while keeping his hands clean. For the first time, doubt crept in. What if he kept doing this? What if no one believed me? That ticket wasn't just a fine, it was a warning. Instead of rushing to argue or confront him, I did the opposite. I sat down, opened my laptop, and organized everything. Dates, times, screenshots, clear video, clips showing Mark waiting, watching, and then deliberately blocking my car. I wrote a short, polite email to the council. No emotions, no accusations, just facts. I attached the footage and explained the pattern as calmly as I could. Hitting send felt strangely powerful. For weeks, Mark had controlled the situation with intimidation and petty tricks. But now the story was no longer just his version. It was documented. And once something is on record, it stops being a game. 3 days later, a council officer arrived on the street just after midday. He measured distances, took photos, and asked quiet questions while pretending it was all routine. Mark tried to act casual, leaning against his SUV with forced confidence, but I could see it slipping. When the officer mentioned multiple reports and video evidence, Mark's posture changed. His shoulders stiffened. His voice dropped. For the first time since this started, he wasn't in control of the situation. The street that once felt like his playground suddenly had rules again, and they weren't written by him. A week passed with unusual quiet. No notes, no blocking, no smug smiles. Then one morning, I saw it, a bright warning notice placed neatly on Mark's windshield. I didn't need to read it to understand what it meant. The council had issued an official warning for obstruction, with clear instructions and consequences if it happened again. Mark stood nearby, pretending to check his tire, avoiding everyone's eyes. The power he once flaunted was gone, replaced by embarrassment. He hadn't lost loudly or dramatically. He had lost silently, the way people do when rules finally catch up to them. From that day on, Mark's SUV vanished from the curb whenever my car was home. He started parking neatly within the lines, sometimes even leaving extra space, as if overcorrecting for every past mistake. We never spoke again, not even a nod in passing. But the tension was still there, quieter, heavier. Every time he walked past my house, his eyes stayed fixed on the ground. The man who once ruled the street with our intimidation now moved like someone afraid of being noticed. The battle hadn't ended with shouting or revenge. It ended with accountability. And that scared him more than any argument ever could. The street slowly returned to normal. But I didn't. The experience changed how I saw neighborly peace. I learned that silence doesn't always mean harmony. Sometimes it's fear wearing a polite face. For weeks, I had adjusted my life to avoid conflict, thinking I was being mature when in reality, I was allowing someone else to control my space. Standing up didn't require shouting or fists. It required patience, evidence, and the courage to let the system do its job. The parking war taught me that real power isn't loud, it's calm, consistent, and documented. Even now, when I park in that same spot beside my driveway, there's a quiet satisfaction that settles in my chest. Not because I embarrassed Mark, not because he lost face, but because I didn't let fear decide how I lived. He still avoids eye contact, still parks carefully, still behaves like someone who knows the rules are watching him, even when no one else is. The street looks the same as it always did, but I'm not the same person anymore. That parking war taught me a lesson. I won't forget. When someone tries to bully you out of your own space, the strongest response isn't rage, it's standing firm, staying smart and letting truth do the talking.